the world global order as well, because to some kind the Ukrainian crisis or Ukraine crisis, what it should be named, it's some kind of trigger or the start of the whole process and the way where we go in future. It is very important nowadays to speak about this crisis in European Union, because it influences European Union in itself, and it defines in what way the European Union itself will be developed in future. Therefore, we need quite a thorough analysis to understand what is about, what it can be, and what probably we and you should do to have good results than bad results. And in Italy, I suppose this topic until now is not as a priority to just objective reasons, but nevertheless the outcome of Ukrainian crisis will influence Italy to the large extent, and we can see that your government or your people in power, they do understand this and try to make own probably lessons from this. So if we start from the crisis, from my perspective, the crisis has three levels. First of all, global level. It's going more and more to this configuration, Russia against so-called West. It means United States plus European Union plus some countries in Asia which are too connected to the Western countries. And Russia is now, logically, if you take all the steps since the beginning of the crisis, it's some kind of anti-Western revolt, and Russia tried to have a pioneer role in the global framework of this anti-Western revolt, changing the rule of the games settled after the end of the Second World War, or even Cold War. And now we enter in so-called turbulence period, and at the end of this period, probably it takes 5 years or it takes even 10 years, but at the end we will have definitely new ranking in the world. If beforehand we had some kind of ranking, #1 United States, then probably European Union, others, probably at the end of this crisis we will have another level. The second level is about our bilateral relations between Ukraine and Russia. Namely, we had before, since 1991, many accidents, some quarrels with Russia, dedicated either to the fall of the Soviet Union or to some special problems. Even Crimea issue was quite controversial, but to some extent we avoided the war situation, we avoided a military confrontation, but now it is not this story. Quite important were actually personal relationships between the leaders. I'm talking mostly about relationships between Putin and three his Ukrainian counterparts, Kuchma, Yushchenko, and Yanukovych. And all of them, they were quite different with Putin, starting with Kuchma, who just overplayed Putin, Yushchenko, which Putin didn't like and didn't understand, but nevertheless they found some solutions. Yanukovych, with whom on the one side Putin was quite comfortable reaching own gains in Ukraine, but on the personal level it was a huge distrust between both and some kind even of humiliation from Putin towards Yanukovych. And coming to the last short-term perspectives for our bilateral relations, you can see just past few weeks, that short-term perspectives are quite bad. It's a great risk of military escalation going further and further, and nobody knows how it will end. And then the third level of this crisis, namely domestic level. Most of all, and Professor Grisak told us that probably the roots of the whole situation is much more not about some bilateral agenda, not about some international agenda, although it matters, but it's about our domestic agenda. Namely that we Ukrainians, since 1991, we should accept this, we failed to build quite a good and comfortable and prosperous state. Although we had, I suppose, such possibilities, although we have such examples on the post-Soviet space building these success stories, but nevertheless, until now, we failed. And this was, I will call it, mismanagement of the whole country. And then it's about need, I would say, some kind of reconciliation between some different groups of population who to some extent could have different interests, could have different views. And this culture of reconciliation is just about these European values, about European idea, just talking to each other, listening to each other, finding some compromises, and not battling each other at once. And the result until now was not so good. Then what I see, what are actually the main reasons of the crisis and triggers. The main geopolitical reason, I suppose, that actually for this region, Eastern European region, the Cold War was actually not over. As far as after the end of the Cold War, there were not taken definite solutions or decisions exactly about these countries or inside this country about their own future. And it was just some kind of silent compromise, but different views. Views from the United States, views from the European Union on the one side, and views from Russia on the other side. To some extent, to some time, it was just silent, and then it became obvious, and it became with much more conflict potential, and now we have some kind of results, and Ukraine is a vivid example, because it's not going about Ukraine. The previous case was about Georgia, for example, and to some extent about other countries. And we have, except, for example, our Ukraine case now, so-called frozen conflicts, which in any minute now could be unfrozen, be it Transnistria, be it Armenia, Azerbaijan, be it Ossetia or Abkhazia. And now these are all the issues to be discussed. Then the second reason, it was actually so-called, and you can see in all the latest declarations during 2 or even 5 years of Russia, starting from Putin, Mr. Lavrov, or many other officials, I would call it Russia offense. Russia is offended that Russia as a state was not understood by the West, and despite all the concessions, as Russia supposed it did, there were no result or no outcome or no just vice versa approach from the West, and it's just like offend. And then it returned, and to some extent it was told by previous speakers, to so-called imperialist agenda or imperium paradigm in Russia, because it's not the story about the last years, it's the story about some previous century, and now it comes back. Then it's about domestic reasons. It's a huge, large extent, unskillful game by Mr. Yanukovych, previous president, namely in foreign policy and security policy. He did not, unfortunately, understand the rules of the game, how she should do something in foreign security policy as a president of Ukraine, and especially in domestic policy. Especially in domestic policy, and we Ukrainians have much to just define some kind of bill to Mr. Yanukovych for what he did wrong, and even more for what he did not in a better way. Then it's about some kind of wrong perceptions and insufficient analysis in the West. To some extent, especially in the former Western countries, there were no so good understanding about the conflict potential, the roots of the whole situation, how it could be settled, when should be done something and not should be done something. And only after the crisis was unfolded and started actually, now we have this understanding that, okay, we need something to do, we need to define the rules, we need to have a good analysis, we need to do something because it's unacceptable to have such a crisis, which actually it's not only about some concrete countries in crisis or in war, it's about the whole Europe, it's about the future of the whole global system. So in order to settle this, we need to tackle the crisis in a right way. And then the triggers. The triggers was actually the first trigger with overwhelming dissatisfaction with Yanukovych inside Ukraine. And that was the major trigger, starting from the students mostly coming to Maidan. It's about non-signing of association agreement in November 2013, and then these forceful actions of Yanukovych, then more and more people coming to Maidan, and this just spillover effect. Then it was about non-signing association agreement and cruelties from the power structures as an answer to some peaceful protest of the people coming tens of and then hundreds of thousands to the street. And then the third trigger, I would call it just last-minute attempts to draw Ukraine to wrong side, either by Russia or to the West. I should confess that in some extension, there were not very unskillful steps, even by some representatives of Western countries, which were not so bad in normal situation, but it was just translated in Russia as very bad, as very offensive, and then it was the reason for Russian authorities to do the next steps, as it was actually the stories. And then I come to this global level as I see key global stakeholders and their positions. First of all, I will talk about United States. I suppose it's about no direct involvement, although indirectly, United States are quite active in Ukraine crisis. Then it was just now two principal issues for the United States and its role on the global agenda to punish Russian Federation or to force Russian Federation to take steps back, because otherwise it would be domino effect. And it's not so about Europe, it's about Asia Pacific. Because now if those countries in Asia Pacific, starting from China and many others, see that despite all the negative reaction from the United States, Russia succeeds to do what it wants, it will be a very bad sign for the United States in that region, which is very important, also as much important or probably more important for the United States as Europe. Then its ambivalent standpoint towards Europe and Russia. It does not coincide fully with European agenda, and of course doesn't coincide with Russian agenda. And then it was quite interesting factor because officially declared so-called pivot to Asia or Asia Pacific in 2009, I suppose, by President Obama. Due to Ukraine crisis, it was stopped because now many efforts from the United States reshuffled to Europe and to Ukraine crisis and this Russian agenda to tackle this issue in first and then Asia Pacific. And the last, and this is why it is important, it is some kind of possibility for China, because beforehand with this pivot to Asia, it was some kind of Chinese perception as now they should confront with the United States, and now it is not the case, because United States are much more preoccupied with this problem. And the last, it's a link to Middle East factor, because even this crisis, it's to some extent interlinked with all the matters which are going in Middle East, starting from the whole transformation, and then to some links either to the global agenda between the United States and Russia, and it's not only about Europe, Ukraine, it's also about some things in Middle East, especially a situation around Iran, in Syria, and in some other countries. And it is to some extent interlinked in negotiations as well. Then about Russia. About Russia, it is obvious, very active involved in all the situation. Many things started by Russia actually, so it's role number one in active involvement. Then it is about, I would call it post-Soviet legacy and some kind revanchist in power or revanchist agenda in power. In many declarations you can see, starting from the, we are very sorry that USSR has collapsed. We were so happy and we would like to have some unity among Slavic nations or among this whole brotherhood. You can find many quotations with this feeling that, that we actually, we Russians, we suppose it was not so bad in Soviet Union, and to some extent we should try to make it backwards to some extent. In modern form, of course, no Soviet Union, but in some modern forms, nevertheless, it should be. Then it is also quite interesting emphasis to be a separate civilization between Europe and Asia. So-called, it was told about Ruski Mir, this idea, it's about to be just neither European nor Asian, to be a separate civilization with own values, with own emphasis, with own views on everything all over the world, and it's quite ambitious agenda, I would say. And then coming back once more about this offensive, accusations to the West. Russia supposes that it got no adequate response to its cooperative proposals and links all the time to these Yugoslavian Kosovo cases, where Russia supposes United States firstly and European Union to some extent were absolutely wrong in doing all what have been done. Then it was told about Ruski Mir and Slavic unity, ideas where Ukraine plays quite a central role for Russia. Without Ukraine, this conception does not work. Then it was the process for Russia since 1991 of gradual but consistent loss of its position inside Ukraine. And probably this crisis is the last attempt of Russia to stop this process or to make it reversal. Although from the historical point of view, from the point of view of historical process, it's an irreversible process, but Russia tries to stop it. And real aims, I suppose, in geopolitical terms, and now it's about, for example, negotiations, what Russia really does want and what she can give and what she cannot give. From my perspective, now the position is, real position, everything except Crimea could be negotiated in Ukrainian case. So Crimea is the red line for Russia. Even Donbass can be given up by Russia, but with some possibilities not to lose face for own population. Then European Union. European Union is directly very affected and involved to a certain degree, not so active as Russia. Sanctions are the main response to Russia, and the problem is that EU was quite powerful in economic and security terms since the founding of European Union, I mean the judicial founding. But then, starting from the midst of 2000s, there is in economic terms and more even in security terms, some kind of decline. I would say that there is a problem with strategic vision and implementation ability inside European Union, starting from objective reasons, too many states, too many interests, too many actors, but even not so objective, it depends on. Then I would see it's a now definite failure of European neighborhood concept. It is definite a failure starting not from Ukraine, but it's now obvious. It was a mistake and failure to apply Central Eastern European matrix to Ukraine. What was with all these Central European states starting from beginning of 90s and then end in 2004 or 2007, I mean enlargement and membership, it does not work in the case of Ukraine. And it was a failure to try to implement automatic this matrix on Ukraine. And now it is obvious we need to do something. And then, and what is this discussion especially important, I would see it's a lack of real expertise on Russia and Eastern Europe inside the European Union, unfortunately. And then about China, it is, from my perspective, total winner as far, because too much gains until now. China was quite and is quite cautious in statements about Ukraine crisis since the beginning and until now, despite all strategic relations with Russia. It's very cautious. Then, in some perspective, as we see now, Russia is going to be, I suppose, a minor partner between China and the United States, or, in the worst-case scenario, asset to be some kind divided. Then it's very interesting to see China's view on Great Europe. And it's very different from the views of United States and European Union and from the actors inside Europe. Okay. And I would recommend you just to think about this Silk Road strategy. Possible future, what we can see. I see for Ukraine crisis 3 scenarios. Cold War, Cold Peace, and neither war nor peace. First scenario, Cold War, and now we're going more and more in this case. It's limited confrontation with possible option of Russia defeat, in the worst case for Russia. And now, to some extent, it is going in this direction. And it would mean change of Putin regime as minimum result. Cold Peace, some kind of settlement and drawing and adhering the lines of influence, repeating the competition of system as it was in Cold War case, so between socialism and capitalism, and non-written rules settled and then obeyed. And to some extent, the most dangerous scenario, and some signs of this scenario we can have now in casualties, it's neither war nor peace, because it's very unpredictable with these all black swans, so many catastrophic scenario could be implied, and very huge potential of unpredictability. And it's very dangerous ambiguity. And then about some numbers about association agreement, what it's about. Actually, it's quite a huge document. The main formula was agreed among one Ukrainian and one French diplomat advisors to the presidents, Sarkozy and Yushchenko in 2007, and then implemented. And it means no membership perspective for Ukraine. It was this gentleman agreement that time. Association agreement, it's not about membership. It's now a little bit another picture, but it was just the start of this principle. In Ukraine, it's as well understood more and more as some membership perspective, although it is not. And now we have one story, very important, DCFTA, a Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, which is a large part of this association agreement. And it's about real process, because according to the trilateral agreement between Russian Federation, European Union, and Ukraine, many sections of this DCFTA are postponed until January 2016 because of huge discussions. And what is very critical for European Union, and it's about lack of expertise. It was firstly the pledge of Ukraine, then the statement of Mr. Putin. Let's talk about DCFTA, let's talk about problems. It was in 2012, 2013. The answer of European Union was categorically, no, we don't want to talk, it's not a problem. And what was the answer of European Union in January, firstly, by Mrs. Merkel in January 2013, and then officially in June 2014, okay, let's talk. And now we can just put a question. If beforehand you told, no, we don't need to have a discussion on this issue, and afterwards you admit, yes, we do need to have a discussion, then the question to your standpoint, in what cases were you thinking quite good about the whole problem? And then the last, it's about so-called hybrid wars, because now it's, despite all military escalation, it's large-scale process. It's about new type of wars and warfare, it's hybrid wars, and probably Ukraine crisis is the first global hybrid war. And it's a comprehensive approach by Russia to destabilize or destruct Ukraine as a state. Very important role of media in these hybrid wars. Then taking military terms, what we definitely do have now in Donbass, in these areas, it's testing new military equipment and tactics by Russian military against Ukrainian forces. And it's very dangerous, because it could be transferred to other cases. And Europe, in this case, could be, or even probably is, in Russian perception, as an accessory target, or next accessory target for Russia. Thanks.
Thank you a lot for your lectures and presentation. I think there are a lot of elements